This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Bruchim haba and welcome everyone to this week's special edition of All Parsha on the Ramban on Parshas Va'era. While in weeks past we've endeavored to speak out a number of comments of the Ramban on the Parsha, this week actually we are going to focus on one passage of the Ramban on the Parsha. And the reason we're going to focus on one is this Ramban is so fundamental to our understanding of Chumash because this Ramban explains literally the most oft repeated pasuk in the entire Chumash. What is the most oft repeated pasuk in the Chumash? A pasuk that appears more than 70 times. Of course, it's Vayedaber Hashem el Moshe le'mar, Perek Vav pasuk Yud. The first time this pasuk appears, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, and the Rebbe Shalom said to Moshe Rabbeinu, saying. And the obvious question here, and the question the Ramban will deal with, is this: we have a superfluous expression. Why Vayedaber and Leimar? It could just say Vayedaber Hashem el Moshe or Vayomer Hashem el Moshe. Why repeat the word Leimar? Perhaps we'll even explain, because there's another question that could be asked over here. The Ramban does not address specifically, and this is addressed by the Vilna Gaon, and that is why two types of expressions, dibur, which usually connotes dibur kasha, harsh speech, and leimar, which usually refers to amira raka, soft speech. So the Ramban endeavors to explain this pasuk that appears so many times throughout the Torah, Vayedaber Hashem el Moshe leimar. And the Ramban begins by citing the Rishonim, namely the Radak in the Sefer Sharoshim, where the Ramban says, Amru ha-mefarshim, the mefarshim, namely the Radak, ki milas leimar b'chal ha-Torah. Whenever it says leimar in the entirety of the Torah, leimar liYisrael, means speak to the Jewish people. And the Rebbeinu Shalom spoke to Moshe that he should say over and relay to the Jewish people. Now, v'hatam, the meaning then is, Sha'amar Hashem l'Moshe, God spoke to Moshe, Emar liYisrael dvarei ela, say over to the Jewish people these words. Now, in this particular pasuk, Perek Vav, pasuk Yud, Vayedaber Hashem el Moshe leimar, Hashem is not telling Moshe to say over to Bnei Yisrael. In fact, he's instructing him what to say to Paroi. And therefore, here the Ramban says, V'kan leimar el Paroi. Here it would be, and God spoke to Moshe to say to Paroi, V'hakasuv she'amar. But the Ramban summarily rejects this pshat of the Radak, and the Ramban asks a number of questions on it. Says Ramban v'hakosov she'amar, the pasuk in Bereshis Lamed Aleph pasuk Chavtes, that Lavan says to Yaakov, Emesh Amar Elai Leimar, God said to me yesterday, saying, Einoi ba al nachem a Parsha does not fit in well according to this explanation, because God did not tell Lavan anything to say over to anybody. God just reprimanded Lavan. So Leimar cannot always mean God said that the person should say over, because when it comes to Lavan, God did not relay anything to Lavan to say over to anybody else. Furthermore, v'chein b'roiv mekayma sheyichbal vayidaber Hashem el Moshe leimar daber el bnei Yisrael v'yamar aleim. And likewise, in most places where it repeats, God said to Moshe, leimar, say over, clearly leimar does not mean to relay, because then the next pasuk would be not needed completely, because if leimar means to say over, why would the Rebbe Shalom need to say daber? So clearly leimar in all of those cases does not mean to say over, because that's the next pasuk, daber el bnei Yisrael, or vayomer Hashem el Moshe leimar, daber el bnei Yisrael v'yamar aleim. So clearly there also leimar does not mean to say over, because that's the next pasuk. Or in Parshas Chukas, vayoimru el kol adas bnei Yisrael leimar, they, Moshe and Aaron, said to the congregation of Israel, saying. They did not say anything to the Bnei Yisrael that the Bnei Yisrael should say over. So clearly leimar does not mean to say over, because Moshe and Aaron did not instruct anything to the Bnei Yisrael that the Bnei Yisrael should say over. Or, vayoimru Bnei Yisrael el Moshe leimar hin gavanu, and the Bnei Yisrael said to Moshe, saying, we're going to die. They didn't tell Moshe anything to say over, they just spoke to Moshe. Or, va'imar aleichem va'isahi leimar, Moshe says to the Jewish people, and I spoke to you at that time saying. Moshe didn't say anything to the Bnei Yisrael to say over. The kiyotze be'elu rabim, and many such examples. V'chein b'seder hazeh, likewise in this particular chapter, where Vayomer Hashem al Moshe ve'Aaron leimar ki yadaber alechem paroi leimar. Firstly, God spoke to Moshe and Aaron to say. What do you mean? He didn't instruct them to say anything. And Paro will say to you, saying. Paro didn't say anything to Moshe that they should say over to anybody else. It is not correctly explained that they should relay it. And therefore the Ramban rejects the pshat of the Radak in the Sefer HaSharashim, and the Ramban introduces us to a very fundamental understanding of what does the most oft repeated pasuk in Chumash mean. So even though we're learning one Ramban, but this is a Ramban that you'll be able to review in your mind at least 70 times over the next year. Every time you see this pasuk and you say, Vayidaber Hashem Moshe leimar, that's such a simple pasuk. This pasuk is reviewing and articulating and enunciating one of the most basic tenets of our belief. Says Ramban, V'hanochain be'inai, what is correct in my eyes, ki milas leimar. The word leimar, lahoiros al beirur ha'inyan, demonstrates clarity. Vayedaber Hashem el Moshe la'amira gemura. God spoke to Moshe. Not hazy, not cloudy, not fuzzy, not basically, but God instructed Moshe clear cut instruction. Loi mara misupekes, not a doubtful or unclear vision. V'loi beremes davar, not insinuating, but rather the Lord always speaks to Moshe Rabbeinu ba'asbaklaria ha'meira, in the most pristine vision, clear-cut vision. Ulakach yasmid zeh b'chol ha'Torah. Therefore, this expression is consistent and repeated throughout the Torah. Ki nevuas Moshe peh el peh. The prophecy of Moshe is mouth to mouth. Yedaber by, God speaks to him. V'loi b'chidos, not with any riddle. And I would just like to add an idea that I believe the Ramban is saying himself, is the reason why this pasuk then is repeated so many times in the Torah, is the fundamental principle of Torah is Moshe Rabbeinu's prophecy is superior to the prophecy of any other Navi, meaning the whole backbone of the Torah. The fundamental foundational principle of the Torah is the supreme status of the prophecy of Moshe Rabbeinu. That everything that Moshe tells us is not his interpretation, is what is called asbaklaria ha'meira, clear, pristine vision. There's no room for interpretation, there's no room for exposition. This is exactly what Hashem told Moshe, and it's so important that we know this because this is the emunah of the Torah, that everything Moshe relates to us is exactly what Hashem told him. What about in some of the other instances where it says Leimar, says Ramban, V'lachein Amar ken leYaakov. That's why Lavan was telling Yaakov, I want you to know, God told me in no uncertain terms that I cannot harm you. Emesh Amar Hashem Elai. Yesterday God said to me, Ba'amira brura, in an absolute expression, Shalai azik lachem, that I cannot harm you. Ki lulei kain, because if God would have told me in some kind of unclear expression, and I could have interpreted, maybe yes harm you, maybe no harm you, then I for sure would have harmed you. Then I certainly would have done evil to you. Likewise, God spoke to Moshe and to Aaron saying, meaning they said, we're very unhappy. They didn't beat around the bush, they didn't hem and haw. They said, Moshe, we are not happy with the way we're being treated. Shahayu aimim lahem kain befeirush. They said this to them explicitly. And they cried out to them openly. Now, the Ramban says that very often in Chumash, you could have two verbs, one after the other. One could be infinitive. One could be what is called the term of inflected. And sometimes the infinitive appears before the inflected, and sometimes vice versa. So, for example, ki hamakar lebeirur ha'inyan pam mukdam upam ucher. The infinitive is added for clarification. Sometimes it comes before, sometimes it comes after. So, in this particular instance, the word leimar is infinitive, and it comes after vayedaber. And another example of this is kamai oimrim amar lemenaatzai. They consistently and always say to those who desecrate me. Here, the word amar is infinitive, and the word Amar appears after the inflective. But this is the Ramban's pshat in Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe Lemar, namely that the Lord spoke to Moshe Rabbeinu in absolute, clear communication. Moshe didn't have to interpret a vision, an image, a picture. This is exactly what Hashem said to Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, I want to just contrast this because amazingly in Parshas Matos on the pasuk, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe zeh hadavar, Rashi points out, Moshe prophesied with the word koi amar Hashem kachatzois halayla. The other Nevi'im prophesied b'koi amar Hashem. Moshe had additional madrega that he was misnave, he prophesied with the word zeh hadavar. What is the meaning over here? So the Mizrahi and the Sifsei Chachamim, they say that the word koi implies, basically this is the message, but it has to be interpreted, and zeh implies absolute clarity, what is called asbaklaria ha'me'ira, as opposed to other Nevi'im who prophesied asbaklaria she'ena me'ira. So other Nevi'im prophesied with the word koi. This is basically what God said. Moshe Rabbeinu had an added level. He prophesied with the word zeh. This is exactly what God said. This is asbaklaria ha'me'ira. The only problem is Rashi begins, Moshe prophesied with koi amar Hashem kachatzois halayla. The other Nevi'im prophesied with koi, and Moshe had added zeh. So that implies that Moshe did at times prophecy with asbaklaria she'ena me'ira. So the Mizrahi says, yes, Moshe began his prophecy as a novice, and when he came to Paro, he said, koi amar Hashem kachatzois halayla. So in the beginning, according to Mizrahi, Moshe did prophecy with what is called an unclear prism. And the Sifsei Chachamim explains, until when did Moshe prophecy with this level of unclarity? Until Sinai, until Kabbalah Torah, and from then on you will never see again the words kai. However, this understanding of the development of the Nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu does not seem to be consistent with the Ramban, because the Ramban learns that Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe Lemar is clear-cut Nevuah, peh el peh, with what we refer to as asbaklaria ha'me'ira, loy mare misupekes v'loy beremez. So here the Mizrahi is saying Moshe at the start of his Nevuah prophesied with koi, and yet Moshe is getting Nevuah Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe Lemar. These comments of the Ramban, I believe, fit better with the understanding of the Gur Aryeh and the Maral. The Maral on Rashi in Parshas Matos says, heaven forbid that Moshe began his prophecy on a lower madrega than the level he was on at Matan Torah. Moshe always prophesied ba'asbaklaria ha'me'ira. But that's only when God was telling him Torah, when God was telling him eternal law for the Jewish people. However, when Moshe Rabbeinu was just given information to relay to Paroi, at that time Moshe Rabbeinu perhaps did receive a nevuah on the level of other Nevi'im, and that's why he prophesied B'koi. So what's interesting is that according to the Maral, there was never a time in Moshe Rabbeinu's life that he was on a lower level of prophecy and he prophesied with Kai. It's just that it depends on what type of information the Rebbeinu Shalom was offering Moshe. If he was offering Moshe Torah, that's Asbaklaria HaMe'ira at all times, according to the Maral. If God was offering Moshe Rabbeinu information to relay, that could have been B'kai. It's interesting, according to this Ramban, Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe Lemar, we do not find other Nevi'im spoken to in this way. Vayidaber Hashem el Yirmiyah Lemar, el Yechezkel Lemar. That could simply be understood because these other prophets did not have Amira Berura. Their Nevuah was Asbaklar Sheinem Ira. The only other individual who we find this terminology, Vayidaber Hashem el Lemar, is Yehoshua. Perhaps because Yehoshua was somewhat on the madrega of Moshe Rabbeinu, as the Chassam Sofer writes, he was Yeshua bin Nun. He was misboinein. He contemplated the 50th level of wisdom that only his Rebbe, Moshe Rabbeinu, knew. For the sake of completion, I must share with you the Vilna Gaon's pshat on the pasuk Vayedaber Hashem al Moshe Lemar. The Vilna Gaon says, Dibor connotes Amira Kasha, harsh speech. Amira connotes Amira Raka, soft speech. There is an idea that the Torah, the Chumash, is somewhat Midas Hadin. As we know, the Torah says 40 lashes. The Torah says an eye for an eye. But the Rabbanan come along and they say, no, 39 lashes. They say, no, not an eye for an eye. Money, pay kesef. So the Torah's viewpoint seems to be conveying Midas Hadin. The viewpoint of the Chachamim is Midas Harachamim. That is why the Gra says in the Gemara, God is referred to as the merciful one, Rachamana. The viewpoint of the Rebbeinu Shalom from the Torah Sheba'al Peh is Rachamim. Torah Shebachsav is Midas Hadin. That is why in the Gemara you always find Amar Abaye, Amar Rava, not Daber Abaye, Daber Rava. Says the Gra, Vayedaber Hashem al Moshe Lemar teaches us that every component of Torah has two parts to it. There's Dibor, Torah Shebachsav, and Amira, Torah Sheba'al Peh. Vayedaber Hashem al Moshe Lemar. This is Torah. Torah has two parts to it. Vayedaber, Dibor Kasha, the Torah Sheba'al Peh, Lemar, Amira Raka, the Torah Shebachsav. I had this chus a few years ago to visit Reb David Kohen, the Rosh Hashiva of Hebron. And he shared with me, why do we say, Friday night, Mogen Avois Bidvaroi, Mechaye Meisim B'mamarai. God shields our forefathers with his Dibor, and he revives the dead with his Amira. Says Reb David Kohen, based on the Gra, we understand beautifully. The fact that God will protect our forefathers, Anoichi Magen Lach, that's written explicitly in the Torah Shebachsav. So Magen Avos Bidvaroi, because of his word in the written law. Mechaye Meisim, the resurrection of the dead, that is alluded to in the Chumash. That's Torah Sheba'al Peh, that's B'ma'amarai. Vayedaber Hashem el Moshe Lemar. It may be an oft-repeated pasuk, but so much depth, fundamental thought lays in this pasuk. Be it the pshat of the Radak that Hashem told Moshe to relay, be it the pshat of the Ramban that God spoke to Moshe in absolute, clear dibur, asbaklaria ha'meira, and of course the Gra, Vayedaber Lemar, Torah Shebachsav, Torah Sheba'al Peh. Wishing everyone a wonderful Shabbos.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.